Welcome to the channel. We're so glad you're here. We love you, and God bless you more. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an update or new video from us. Stay connected and be the first to watch our latest content. Let me quickly attend to Dad. He has sent for me to assist him with something. But I have been so curious and eager to deepen my understanding of the Bible and the spirit realm.
Why have you not joined me here since I called for you? I've been waiting for you to assist me.
I'm sorry. I realized that you had been busy reading for hours, so I didn't want to interrupt you. I got caught up in something myself.
What has captured your attention so much that you've lost track of time?
It's Elijah. I've been reading about him for days. His life and the way he interacted with the Lord have completely captivated my mind.
Elijah, you say? What about him has caught your attention?
It's everything, really. His boldness in confronting kings, his reliance on God for miracles, and especially his profound moments of vulnerability. I've been delving into how Elijah worked with the Lord, and it's been eye-opening. The depth of his faith and the way he prayed with such fervor, it's as if I'm seeing a new dimension of how one can walk with God.
That's wonderful to hear. Elijah's story is indeed rich with lessons and mysteries. One of the deepest secrets of Elijah that Christians can learn is his absolute reliance on God and unwavering obedience, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Elijah's life reveals profound truths about faith, courage, and the power of prayer. 1. Dependence on God. Elijah's dependence on God is one of the most remarkable aspects of his story, offering a profound lesson in trust and surrender. In 1 Kings 17, we see the prophet in a situation where his survival entirely hinges on God's provision. The land of Israel is suffering from a severe drought, which Elijah himself had foretold as a consequence of the nation's rebellion against God. As the drought deepened and the resources in the land dried up, Elijah found himself in desperate need. But it is precisely in this dire situation that God's faithfulness and miraculous provision become most evident. In an act that seems both mysterious and miraculous, God sends ravens to bring Elijah food while he hides by the Kerith brook. 1 Kings 17, 4-6. This moment is rich with symbolic meaning and teaches a vital lesson about how God's ways transcend human expectations. Ravens, which were considered unclean animals in Jewish law, become the unlikely agents of divine provision. This teaches that God can use the most unexpected sources and methods to meet our needs, often defying our logic or understanding. Elijah did not question God's command, nor did he fret over how this peculiar arrangement would work. He simply trusted and obeyed, and every morning and evening, the ravens brought him bread and meat, sustaining him through the drought. This story reminds us that God's provision doesn't always come in the form we expect. Sometimes, he provides in ways that challenge our understanding or our sense of how things should work. We might expect help to come from obvious or respectable sources, but God often works outside of conventional boundaries, using what seems unlikely or even unclean to fulfill his purposes. It's a powerful demonstration that God is sovereign over all creation and that nothing is beyond his control, not even the behavior of wild animals. If he can command ravens to feed a prophet, he can certainly meet our needs in ways that are beyond our comprehension. Later, as the brook dries up due to the ongoing drought, Elijah receives another surprising directive from God, to go to Zarephath, where a widow will provide for him. 1 Kings 17, 8-16. This situation seems even more improbable than the ravens, for in ancient society, widows were often among the poorest and most vulnerable. It would be logical to assume that a widow, living in the middle of a drought with a child to care for, would have nothing to offer. Yet again, God turns human expectations upside down. When Elijah meets the widow, she is gathering sticks to prepare her last meal, believing that she and her son will die afterward due to their lack of food. But Elijah, following God's command, asks her to make him a small cake first, promising that her flour and oil will not run out until the day the Lord sends rain. In this incredible test of faith, both for Elijah and the widow, God provides miraculously. The flour and oil, which should have run out, continue to replenish themselves daily, sustaining Elijah, the widow, and her son for the duration of the drought. This encounter reveals a deeper truth about God's provision. He provides not just for one person, but often for entire communities when faith and obedience are exercised. The widow's willingness to trust Elijah's word, even in her desperation, unlocked God's abundant provision for her household. This part of Elijah's story is deeply instructive for modern believers. It teaches that faith in God's provision often requires us to step out into situations that make no sense from a human perspective. It challenges our understanding of scarcity and abundance, showing that with God, what seems insufficient can become more than enough. Elijah's reliance on God, whether through the unlikely service of ravens or the meager resources of a widow, illustrates that God's supply is not bound by earthly limitations. He is the God of abundance who provides in the wilderness and sustains his people in times of drought, often in the most creative and surprising ways. In a broader sense, Elijah's dependence on God is a reminder that we are not called to rely on our own strength or resources, but to place our trust entirely in him. Whether we are in a season of abundance or lack, God's provision is sufficient. He may use means that seem improbable or even impossible, but his faithfulness never fails. The story of Elijah and the ravens, as well as his encounter with the widow, teaches us that God's care for us is intimate, precise, and often beyond our ability to predict or understand. It invites us into a deeper trust, knowing that, as Elijah experienced, God's provision always comes at the right time, in the right way, even if it arrives through the wings of a raven or the hands of a poor widow.
Wow.
2. Obedience despite fear. Elijah's confrontation with King Ahab and the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings 18 is one of the most dramatic moments in the Bible, filled with lessons about faith, courage, and the power of obedience. In this narrative, Elijah is not just dealing with a king, but with an entire nation that has turned away from God, led by the corrupt influence of Ahab and his wife Jezebel, who had introduced the worship of Baal on a large scale in Israel. What makes Elijah's actions so remarkable is that he obeyed God's instructions despite the very real danger to his life, demonstrating that true courage and faith is not the absence of fear but the resolve to act in obedience despite it. At the heart of Elijah's mission was a bold, divine command to confront King Ahab and challenge the prophets of Baal. This was no small task. Ahab was known for his ruthlessness, and Jezebel had already been killing off the Lord's prophets. Elijah was, in many ways, a hunted man, a lone prophet going up against a regime that had embraced idolatry and was determined to silence anyone who opposed it. Yet, when God commanded Elijah to present himself to Ahab, he obeyed without hesitation, even though it meant risking his life. The tension of this moment is palpable. Elijah's return from hiding was not merely about delivering a message, but also about standing up to the spiritual decay of an entire nation. Elijah understood the gravity of the situation. This was a direct challenge to the power structure of Israel. Ahab had already labeled him as a troubler of Israel, 1 Kings 18:17, implying that Elijah was the reason for the famine and drought, when in reality, it was the king's own idolatry that had brought God's judgment upon the land. Elijah could have let fear keep him in hiding. He could have reasoned that it was better to stay safe, continue worshipping God quietly, and avoid confrontation. But Elijah understood something deeper about his calling. When God gives a command, obedience is not optional, even when it brings danger. What makes Elijah's obedience so powerful is that he didn't go alone. Though he faced great peril, his confidence rested in the fact that he was acting under divine authority. He wasn't challenging Ahab and the prophets of Baal out of his own bravado or personal agenda. He was carrying out God's will. This is a key lesson for believers. Obedience to God often places us in situations where fear is natural, but our courage comes from knowing we are walking in His will. The scene that unfolds on Mount Carmel is nothing short of spectacular. Elijah, standing alone as God's prophet, challenges 450 prophets of Baal to a showdown to prove who the real God is. The stakes couldn't be higher. Elijah proposes that both he and the prophets of Baal prepare a sacrifice, and the God who answers by fire will be the true God. It's a life or death moment, and Elijah's challenge is not only a direct insult to the Baal worshippers, but a public test of God's power. If God didn't answer Elijah's prayer, he would likely be killed, and Baal worship would reign supreme in Israel. Elijah was putting everything on the line for the sake of obedience. Throughout the day, the prophets of Baal call on their God, dancing, shouting, and even cutting themselves in desperation, but no fire comes. Then, Elijah steps forward. With calm confidence, he rebuilds the altar of the Lord, douses the sacrifice with water 3 times over to ensure there could be no trickery, and prays a simple yet profound prayer. His words reflect his deep faith and the purpose behind his boldness. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. 1 Kings 18:37. In an instant, fire from heaven consumes the entire sacrifice, the stones, the water, and the dust around the altar. It's a moment of undeniable victory, as the people fall to the ground, proclaiming, "The Lord, He is God." 1 Kings 18:39. Elijah's obedience, in the face of overwhelming odds and danger, led to one of the most powerful demonstrations of God's sovereignty in the Bible. But it's important to recognize that this victory came because Elijah acted with courage, not because he was fearless, but because he chose to obey God's command despite his fear. What makes this story even more relatable is that, shortly after this victory, Elijah is gripped by fear when Jezebel vows to kill him. He flees into the wilderness, overwhelmed and discouraged, even asking God to take his life. 1 Kings 19:4. This shows that even the most faithful servants of God experience moments of fear and doubt. Elijah, the same man who stood boldly against 450 prophets of Baal, now ran from a single threat. It's a reminder that courage and faith is not a constant state of fearlessness. It's an ongoing choice to trust and obey God, even when we are afraid. Elijah's story teaches us that true obedience requires stepping out in faith, even when the path ahead seems dangerous. It shows that courage is not about never feeling fear, but about choosing to follow God's voice despite the fear. Elijah could have stayed in hiding, but his obedience led to a nation witnessing the power of the true God. In the same way, our acts of obedience, no matter how small or large, carry the potential for God to work powerfully through us. We might not be called to confront kings or challenge hundreds of false prophets, but every act of obedience to God's will, especially when it is difficult or risky, has the potential to bring glory to God and impact the world around us. Elijah's story encourages believers to trust God's plan, even when it seems dangerous or uncertain. It reminds us that, though fear may come, our ultimate confidence rests not in our ability but in God's faithfulness. Just as Elijah stood alone on Mount Carmel, knowing that God would show up, we too can stand firm in our obedience, trusting that God is with us and that His power is greater than anything we fear. 3. The power of prayer. Elijah's prayer life is a profound testament to the power and effectiveness of fervent, faith-filled prayer. The narrative of Elijah praying for rain in 1 Kings 18:41-45 is not only a remarkable account of divine intervention, but also a compelling illustration of how prayer, when coupled with unwavering faith, can effect significant change and align with God's purposes. Elijah's story unfolds against the backdrop of a severe drought that has ravaged Israel for 3.5 years. This drought was a direct consequence of the nation's idolatry and sin, a divine judgment proclaimed by Elijah himself. During this period, the land suffered immense hardship, and the people were in desperate need of relief. Yet, it was also a season of spiritual testing and renewal, where the true power of God would be revealed through his prophets' prayers. After Elijah's dramatic confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, where God had answered by fire and demonstrated his supreme authority, the prophet's next step was to address the pressing need for rain. This transition from a dramatic showdown to a fervent act of prayer is crucial. It highlights that the power of prayer is not merely about asking for needs to be met but about aligning oneself with God's will and timing. Elijah's approach to prayer is instructive. He begins by going to the top of Mount Carmel and humbling himself in prayer, placing his face between his knees, a posture of intense concentration and earnestness. This act symbolizes a profound dependence on God and an understanding that the coming rain was not something Elijah could control or command by his own power. It was entirely in God's hands. Elijah's prayer is both fervent and persistent. He sends his servant to look for signs of rain, and despite the servant returning multiple times with reports of clear skies, Elijah continues to pray. This persistence in prayer demonstrates a crucial aspect of effective intercession, the commitment to pray until the answer is clear. Elijah's determination reflects a deep faith in God's promises and a refusal to give up until he sees the fulfillment of what he believes God has promised. Finally, on the 7th time of sending his servant to look for signs, a small cloud the size of a man's hand appears on the horizon. Elijah immediately recognizes this as the answer to his prayer. He tells his servant to warn Ahab to prepare for rain, signaling a dramatic change in weather. Shortly after, the heavens open, and a torrential downpour ends the long drought. This sequence of events reveals several powerful truths about prayer. First, Elijah's experience teaches that fervent prayer is grounded in faith. Elijah's unwavering belief in God's power and his persistence in prayer highlight how faith and prayer are interconnected. Effective prayer is not just about the act of asking, but about believing in God's capacity to answer. Second, Elijah's prayer life underscores the importance of aligning prayer with God's will. The drought had been a consequence of Israel's disobedience, and Elijah's prayer was not just about bringing relief, but about restoring the nation's relationship with God. This alignment shows that prayer is most powerful when it seeks to fulfill divine purposes rather than personal desires. Third, the passage illustrates the value of persistence in prayer. Elijah's continued intercession despite the lack of immediate evidence of change shows that prayer is not always about instantaneous results. It requires perseverance and a steadfast belief in God's timing. This persistence is not a sign of doubt but a reflection of deep faith in God's eventual response. In James 5:16-18, the New Testament echoes Elijah's story, emphasizing that the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. James uses Elijah as an example to illustrate that fervent prayer, grounded in righteousness and faith, can accomplish great things. Elijah's example reinforces the idea that prayer is a vital tool for engaging with God's power and participating in his work on earth. Elijah's prayer life invites believers to approach prayer with a sense of urgency, faith, and persistence. It challenges us to align our prayers with God's will and to trust in his timing, even when the answers are not immediately visible. Elijah's story is a vivid reminder that prayer is a dynamic and potent force through which God works to bring about his purposes, and it calls us to engage deeply and earnestly in our own prayer lives, believing in the transformative power of fervent, faith-filled communication with God. 4. Vulnerability and God's compassion. The story of Elijah's vulnerability and God's compassion following the dramatic events on Mount Carmel is a poignant testament to God's grace and understanding of human frailty. After a monumental confrontation with the prophets of Baal, Elijah finds himself in a state of profound despair, revealing a deep truth about the nature of faith and the care of God for those who serve him. Jezebel, the queen who had been a staunch advocate of Baal worship, was furious at the death of her prophets and vowed to kill Elijah. Faced with this threat, Elijah fled into the wilderness, overwhelmed by fear and exhaustion. This drastic shift from victory to despair is striking and underscores a critical aspect of the human experience. Even the most devout and victorious believers are not immune to moments of profound weakness and vulnerability. In the wilderness, Elijah's state of mind deteriorates. He sits under a broom tree, utterly dejected, and prays for God to take his life, saying, "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." 1 Kings 19:4. This request is a raw expression of his deep emotional and spiritual exhaustion. Elijah's earlier courage and faith seem to dissolve in the face of relentless personal fear and a sense of futility. His despair is compounded by the sense of isolation. He feels as though he is the only one left who is faithful to God, adding to his feeling of being overwhelmed and alone. This moment of vulnerability is significant because it highlights a profound truth. Even the greatest spiritual heroes can experience deep emotional and spiritual crises. Elijah's request for death reveals the limits of human strength and the reality that even those who have experienced remarkable victories can face moments of intense weakness and doubt. It serves as a reminder that spiritual battles are not only fought on grand stages, but also within the hearts of believers. Yet, it is precisely in this state of profound weakness that God's compassion shines most brightly. God's response to Elijah's plea is not one of condemnation or rebuke, but of gentle care and restoration. An angel visits Elijah and provides him with food and water, allowing him to regain physical strength. This provision is not just practical but deeply comforting, showing that God meets our needs with tenderness and provision. After Elijah's physical needs are met, he journeys to Mount Horeb, where God meets him again. In a powerful and intimate encounter, God does not appear in the dramatic displays of power like the wind, earthquake, or fire, but in a gentle whisper. 1 Kings 19:11-13. This encounter emphasizes that God's presence and care are not always in grand manifestations, but can be found in the quiet moments of intimacy and reassurance. God's conversation with Elijah at Horeb reveals that he is not alone, as Elijah believes. God informs him that there are still 7,000 in Israel who have not bowed to Baal. 1 Kings 19:18. This revelation is a powerful reminder that God is at work in ways beyond Elijah's immediate perception. It brings Elijah out of his isolation and reassures him that he is part of a larger, ongoing divine plan. The restoration of Elijah, physically through the sustenance provided, emotionally through the assurance of God's presence, and spiritually through the reassurance of a continued divine purpose, demonstrates a profound aspect of God's nature. It shows that God meets us in our brokenness with grace and care. He understands our limitations and responds not with judgment, but with compassion and encouragement. Elijah's experience teaches that vulnerability and weakness are not signs of failure but aspects of the human condition that God fully understands. His compassion extends to our moments of deepest despair, providing not only for our immediate needs, but also restoring our sense of purpose and connection. This story invites believers to embrace their own moments of weakness, knowing that God meets them with the same grace and restorative care. It reassures us that even in our most desperate times, when faith seems to falter and the weight of our struggles feels unbearable, God is present, providing comfort, strength, and a renewed sense of His loving presence and purpose. In essence, Elijah's encounter with God in his time of despair is a profound illustration of how divine compassion works. It shows that God's love is active in our most vulnerable moments, offering not just physical relief, but emotional and spiritual renewal. This deepens our understanding of God's character and encourages us to approach Him with honesty in our own times of need, trusting that He will meet us with the same grace and care.
It's amazing. I've discovered the deepest secret of how Elijah worked with the Lord. It's not just about the miracles he performed or the dramatic confrontations he faced, but about his intimate relationship with God and his unwavering trust. Even when he felt alone and overwhelmed, his persistence in prayer and faith in God's promises were what made him so powerful. This understanding has really deepened my appreciation for his spiritual journey.
I'm so glad to hear that. Elijah's life offers profound lessons for anyone seeking to deepen their walk with God. Your enthusiasm and eagerness to understand more are truly encouraging. Keep exploring and learning. There is so much wisdom to be gained from studying such faithful servants of God.
Thank you. I'm really excited about what I've learned and look forward to uncovering even more. It feels like I'm beginning to understand what it means to walk with God in a new and deeper way.
That's the spirit. Continue in your studies with that same passion, and you'll find that God will reveal even more to you. Your curiosity and dedication are inspiring.
I will. Thanks for encouraging me. I'm eager to see where this journey of understanding will lead.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.